The very first question was the one almost everyone watching had been asking. Did you kill Nolan? There was no slow introduction, no easing into the conversation, just a direct question placed in front of a young man who had suddenly found himself at the center of one of the most talked-about investigations on the Gulf Coast. His name was Warren, and before he answered anything else, he wanted people to understand one thing. Nolan wasn't just my best friend, he was my brother. That simple statement set the tone for everything that followed. In the weeks after Nolan Wells' death, rumors had spread quickly across social media. Friends who had spent years together suddenly found themselves under a microscope. Every photograph, every text message, every public appearance was being examined by strangers trying to piece together what had happened on the 4th of July. Before we go any further, welcome to the channel. If you enjoy thoughtful, evidence-based coverage of cases like this, take a moment to subscribe. It really helps us continue bringing you carefully researched stories. And now, let's go back to Warren's account. Some members of Nolan's friend group reportedly chose not to speak publicly because they feared the attention, and, according to the interviewer, some had even expressed concerns about threats that had been directed toward them. Warren decided to do something different. He agreed to sit down for an extended interview and answer difficult questions, including the one that opened the conversation. Before discussing the events of that holiday weekend, he wanted viewers to know who Nolan Wells really was, at least through the eyes of someone who had known him for years. According to Warren, their friendship stretched back to their school days. They had gone through elementary school, middle school, high school, and even their freshman year of college together. It wasn't the kind of friendship built around occasional weekends or shared hobbies. It was the kind where talking on the phone every day felt completely normal. When he described Nolan, his voice remained steady. He said Nolan had a way of lighting up every room he entered. He remembered someone who smiled often, avoided arguments, and rarely spoke badly about anyone. In his words, he had never seen Nolan intentionally hurt another person with cruel comments. Instead, he remembered someone who was easy to be around, and someone people naturally wanted in their company. As Warren talked, it became clear that his memories weren't centered on one dramatic event. They were built from hundreds of ordinary moments, going out to eat together, talking after school, spending weekends with friends, sharing jokes that only longtime friends understood. Those everyday memories were what made Nolan's death so difficult to accept. The interviewer then shifted the conversation toward Nolan's family. There had been public discussion suggesting that Nolan's mother may not have known many of the young men who described themselves as his closest friends. Warren explained that while he had met Nolan's father on several occasions, most of their time together had actually been spent at the homes of friends rather than at Nolan's house. He emphasized that this never affected the friendship itself. Their group remained close throughout high school and into college. With that background established, the interview moved to the day that has since become the focus of so many questions, the 4th of July. For people who don't live along Mississippi's Gulf Coast, it may be difficult to picture what that day looks like. According to Warren, boating isn't just a hobby there. It's part of the local culture. Every Independence Day, thousands of people head toward places like Horn Island and Ship Island. Families gather. Friends bring coolers filled with food and drinks. Boats line up along the shoreline from morning until sunset. He explained that this wasn't a special trip organized just for Nolan. It was something they had done before. In fact, Warren recalled that Nolan had been with them on the water during previous 4th of July celebrations as well. Going boating together was simply part of their routine whenever everyone returned home from college. As the morning began, Warren described waking up at a friend's house before heading out for breakfast. He remembered stopping at McDonald's, getting food, and preparing one of the boats for the day ahead. Ice was loaded, fuel was topped off, and several friends coordinated where everyone would meet before heading toward Horn Island. One detail stood out immediately. According to Warren, This was never a small gathering. He estimated that between 20 and 30 people planned to travel together using 3 separate boats. Some friends were arriving from college. Others were longtime classmates from Ocean Springs. Everyone would gather at the dock before making the trip across the water together. That point mattered to him. He believed public discussion had left many people with the impression that only a handful of young men had gone to the island with Nolan that day. He strongly disagreed. According to his account, the island was packed. He estimated there were thousands of people celebrating throughout Horn Island on the 4th of July, with boats stretching as far as he could see. In his description, it was one of the busiest days of the year along the Gulf Coast. The interviewer paused there. If Warren's recollection was accurate, then the setting looked very different from what many viewers may have imagined. Instead of an isolated group spending the day alone, there were crowds, music, boats arriving from every direction, and hundreds, perhaps thousands, of potential witnesses spread across miles of shoreline. At first, that seemed straightforward, but another detail stood out. Although Warren painted a picture of a joyful holiday surrounded by friends, investigators would later focus on the final hours of that same day. Somewhere between the morning preparations, the celebrations on Horn Island, and the decision to leave earlier than expected, something happened that changed everything for Nolan Wells. That brings us to the next stage of Warren's account, where the timeline begins to narrow and attention turns to the hours leading up to the group's unexpected departure from the island. As the boats eased away from the dock that morning, there was nothing to suggest the day would end in tragedy. According to Warren, the weather could hardly have been better. The water was calm, the sky was clear, and the boats stayed together as they made the trip toward Horn Island. Music was playing, friends were laughing, and everyone was looking forward to spending the holiday on the water. He described it as exactly the kind of 4th of July people along Mississippi's Gulf Coast wait for every year. The group wasn't traveling on a single boat. Warren explained that Nolan rowed out on one vessel while he traveled on another with several college friends. A third boat carried additional members of the group. Splitting up wasn't unusual. With roughly 20 to 30 people making the trip together, it was simply the easiest way to get everyone to the island safely. As they approached Horn Island, the scale of the gathering became even more apparent. According to Warren, boats already covered the shoreline by the time they arrived around 10:30 that morning. They stretched across the water in multiple rows, with celebrations taking place all along the island. He estimated that some areas held well over 1,000 people, while activity continued across the island's 10 to 12 miles. For viewers trying to picture the scene, it wasn't a quiet beach or an isolated sandbar. It looked more like a floating community. People were anchored side by side. Music drifted across the water from every direction. Friends moved between neighboring boats, greeting familiar faces they hadn't seen in months. Families unpacked coolers, while younger groups gathered near the shoreline. Warren said that after tying the boats together with both bow and stern anchors, everyone climbed into the shallow water. As more boats arrived, the crowd around them continued to grow throughout the day. What began with one group of friends eventually turned into dozens of people gathered in the same area. He was careful not to suggest that anyone was behaving differently from the rest of the crowd. According to his account, most people were drinking, socializing, and enjoying the holiday. He described it as one large celebration, with college students, longtime friends, and local families all sharing the same stretch of shoreline. That would have been the end of it if the day had unfolded as expected, but later events would cause investigators and the public to examine every interaction that took place on the island. The interviewer wanted to know one specific detail. Where was Nolan during all of this? Warren admitted he couldn't account for Nolan's every movement. He said there were simply too many people. Rather than staying beside one person throughout the afternoon, he moved naturally through the crowd, speaking with friends from high school, classmates from college, and people he hadn't seen in quite some time. That, he explained, was exactly what everyone else was doing as well. Still, he did remember seeing Nolan several times. Each conversation, he recalled, felt completely ordinary. They joked with one another, laughed, and caught up with friends. Warren said Nolan appeared to be enjoying himself and never gave him any indication that something was wrong. Like many others at the celebration, Nolan had reportedly been drinking, but Warren insisted nothing about those brief conversations struck him as unusual at the time. Looking back after everything that happened, those simple moments carried much more weight. A casual joke, a familiar smile, a conversation that lasted only a few minutes. At the time, none of those memories seemed especially important. After Nolan's death, they became moments Warren replayed in his mind, again and again. Then the interviewer asked about something more personal. He reminded Warren of a story he had shared privately before the cameras started rolling. It involved a conversation Nolan had on the island that day and what the holiday meant to him. Warren smiled as he remembered the kind of friend Nolan had always been. He described someone who was constantly smiling in photographs, someone who could brighten the mood of an entire group with a joke. Their friendship, he explained, was built on laughter. Their circle of friends teased one another constantly, but beneath the joking was genuine loyalty. If anyone needed help or someone to talk to, the others were there without hesitation. Warren said Nolan was exactly that kind of friend. Those reflections painted a picture very different from the speculation that had circulated online. Instead of focusing on accusations, Warren returned again and again to ordinary memories of friendship. For him, Nolan wasn't simply the subject of headlines. He was the friend who answered phone calls, the one who showed up, the one who made people laugh. The interviewer then shifted the discussion toward a point in the timeline that has drawn considerable attention. According to Warren, the group had arrived around mid-morning. The holiday celebration was still in full swing hours later, with many people remaining on the island. Then, unexpectedly, something happened. The interviewer pointed out that although people were continuing to celebrate, Warren's group began preparing to leave earlier than many others. He asked the question that naturally followed. Why? What happened that afternoon that caused everyone to pull up the anchors, start the engines, and head away from Horn Island before the celebration had truly ended? According to the interview transcript, that moment marked the beginning of a completely different chapter in the day's events. It was no longer about music, crowded beaches, or friends enjoying a holiday together. It was about the decisions made in the final hours before Nolan Wells disappeared from the celebration, and the questions that investigators would later spend months trying to answer. By late afternoon, the atmosphere on Horn Island was still much the same as it had been all day. Music continued to play across the shoreline. Boats remained anchored in long rows. Groups of friends were still gathered in the water, talking and laughing as the 4th of July celebration carried on around them. Most people had no reason to leave. According to Warren, many visitors planned to stay until much later in the evening to enjoy the holiday before making the trip back across the Mississippi Sound. That was why the next part of his story stood out. The interviewer reminded viewers that Warren's group had arrived at Horn Island around 10:30 that morning. They had spent hours with friends, moving between conversations and enjoying what appeared to be a typical holiday gathering. Yet sometime around the late afternoon, the decision was made to leave before many of the other boats began heading home. Exactly what prompted that decision would become one of the most closely examined parts of the timeline. The transcript available from this interview ends just as Warren begins explaining why the group prepared to depart, so the details of his explanation are not included in the source provided. What the transcript does show is the interviewer emphasizing that something occurred which made the group start the boats and head away from the island earlier than expected. For many people following the Nolan Wells investigation, that period has remained especially significant. Investigators have worked to establish an accurate timeline of who was where, when different boats left, and what happened during the hours that followed. Public discussion has often centered on those questions, but as Warren's interview demonstrates, there is also another side to the story, one that focuses less on speculation and more on remembering the young man at the center of it all. Throughout the conversation, Warren repeatedly returned to the same theme. He wanted people to remember Nolan as a friend, rather than simply as a name in a criminal investigation. He spoke about growing up together, attending school together, and sharing years of ordinary experiences that now carried extraordinary meaning. He described someone who enjoyed being on the water, someone who looked forward to spending holidays with friends, and someone whose personality left an impression on nearly everyone who knew him. Those memories may not answer every question surrounding the case, but they provide important context. When investigations receive national attention, it is easy for timelines, evidence, and public debate to overshadow the person at the center of the story. Warren seemed determined not to let that happen. He recalled Nolan's sense of humor. He remembered how naturally conversations flowed within their close-knit group. He spoke about the loyalty they shared, explaining that if one friend needed support, the others would always be there. According to Warren, Nolan lived by that same principle. At the same time, Warren acknowledged the intense scrutiny his group had faced. He explained earlier in the interview that some friends had reportedly chosen not to speak publicly because they feared the attention and the threats they believed had been directed toward them. His own decision to participate in the interview reflected a desire to share his perspective, even knowing that every word would likely be examined by viewers following the case. Whether people agree with his account or not, the interview adds another first-hand voice to the growing record surrounding Nolan Wells' death. It also highlights an important reality about high-profile investigations. Different witnesses often remember the same day differently. Memories can overlap in some places and differ in others. Investigators compare those accounts alongside physical evidence, electronic records, and forensic findings to establish the most accurate timeline possible. Where questions remain unresolved, it is important not to treat assumptions as established fact. As of the material contained in this interview transcript, Warren's account presents his recollections of Nolan's character, the group's 4th of July tradition, the crowded conditions at Horn Island, and the events leading up to their departure. The transcript provided does not include what happened after the group left the island, nor does it resolve the broader investigative questions that followed. For many viewers, that may be the most difficult part of this story. There are still questions. There are still details that investigators have worked to piece together, and there are still people on every side of the case who continue to search for answers. One thing, however, comes through clearly in Warren's interview. Before the headlines, before the interviews, and before the public debate, Nolan Wells was someone's lifelong friend. As Warren said near the beginning of the conversation, he wasn't simply a best friend, he was my brother. What do you think about Warren's account of that 4th of July? Does hearing directly from one of Nolan's closest friends change the way you view the timeline, or do you believe there are still important questions that need to be answered? If you enjoy thoughtful, evidence-focused coverage of ongoing investigations, be sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you don't miss future updates as new information becomes available.